Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are all the way to the Cold War, woo woo! 1945 to 1963. Very, very interesting period of time. Alright, so this is a recruitment poster for the Civil Defense Council of TNEC, aiming to gain support for organizing emergency preparation and response efforts. You can see the photo of the mushroom cloud there, emphasizing the dangers of atomic weapons. The message, it can happen here, referring to the atomic bomb, but also stressing to Americans who might be complacent after World War II, which left North America untouched. They were not invulnerable. Alright, so containment in a divided global order. So origins of the Cold War. So where does it all start? So it's going to start with the big three right there. And the picture, the color picture on the right, that's going to be the Yalta Conference. Your big three there are Churchill on the left, FDR in the middle, and Stalin on the right. They met in February of 1945. Anybody know when World War II ends? Anybody? Yes, April 1945. Anybody know when our friend FDR passes? Again, beginning of April 1945. And you can see in that picture, he does not look super healthy. So, let's see. So they decide to create a United Nations with 5 nations, the 3 of them plus France and China, holding permanent seats on a Security Council. Fates of nations of Eastern Europe divide the big 3. So FDR and Churchill agreed that Poland should be in the Soviet sphere of influence because of Stalin's desire for a buffer between Germany. They agreed to free and unfettered elections to be held in border nations. Keep that in mind. All right, later on, Truman becomes the replacement for FDR when FDR passes in April of 1945. He goes to the Potsdam Conference. And immediately he wants to stand up to Stalin. He's unwilling to negotiate at the July 1945 Potsdam Conference. This is after Europe has surrendered, after Germany has surrendered, but before Japan. So free elections are held in Finland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. But oddly enough, not Poland or Romania, both occupied by Stalin and the Red Army. To Americans, the failure of Stalin to hold elections in all of the border nations was the precipitating event of the Cold War. Conflict over Germany led to agreements that paved the way for its division into East and West. So we'll talk more about East and West Germany in a bit. But this is also the time. There are several accounts of this Potsdam Conference. So one of the things that was supposed to have been accomplished, and this was an agreement between Truman and Churchill, Churchill knows about the atomic weapons, is that Truman is going to tell Stalin. But I don't know that I guess he didn't trust Stalin. He wasn't sure about him, whatever. He goes up to Stalin, makes very vague references to things changing and having some weapons or something like that, but he doesn't actually say the atomic bomb. And then he kind of walks away. And Stalin just kind of stays stone-faced, and some of the accounts say they didn't think he understood, they didn't know what he was talking about, that kind of stuff. But Stalin knew very well what Truman was talking about. He actually sent his people off to keep working on their atomic bomb, which they had stolen. They had spies in the United States that had spied on our atomic weapon. So with those plans, they were making their own. So there's some conflict there. One of the other agreements that's made here is that if Japan doesn't surrender, that Russia will help with the fight against Japan. All right. Okay. So in February of 1946, the long telegram was sent by American diplomat George F. Kennan in Moscow. Oh, okay. So I guess we skipped the atomic bomb. I guess because you already talked about it. So keep in mind they did drop the atomic bomb in August. The dropping of the atomic bomb is what starts the Cold War. It's what starts the weapons race between the United States and the Soviet Union. All right. So long telegram sent by George F. Kennan in Moscow. He calls for long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. He believed that the Soviet system would eventually collapse if the U.S. and its allies opposed Soviet expansion in all parts of the world. Britain was in decline after the war, unable to aid their anti-communist ally Greece. They were fighting a civil war. That didn't sound right. They weren't able to help anti-communist ally Greece, so people against communism. They were fighting a civil war. So we come up with the Truman Doctrine in March of 1947, a speech in which Truman asserts an American responsibility to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And this policy is really kind of what we utilize to move forward, this idea that we are going to help anybody who wants our help if they're trying to fight communism. Truman proposed assistance for Greece and Turkey. Congress approves it. So an aid program for Western Europe was established, known as the Marshall Plan, to help European nations recover from war. Restrictions kept Soviets from participating and intensified the Cold War. So the Truman Plan is basically they're going to send weapons, help, that kind of stuff. But the Marshall Plan, it's money. Sending money to assist people, because the idea was that if they weren't in dire straits, then they wouldn't be able to, if they have the money, then they would be able to fight communism on their own, is the idea. Alright, so with no agreement for unification of Germany, the U.S., Britain, and France consolidate their zones in 1947. After June of 1948, Soviet blockades of West Berlin, American and British pilots begin an airlift of materials into the city. So basically, I know this map is very, very tiny. Let me get the mouse here. Oh, actually, let's draw. Okay. That's good. Red for the commies. Okay, so this right here is East Germany. In the middle where that blue arrow is Berlin. Berlin, the capital of Germany, is in the middle of East Germany. All right, so Berlin is divided up in the same way that Germany is divided up. So if you look over here, you have East Berlin, you have West Berlin. So this is going to be Great Britain, the United States, and France. And this is going to be the Soviet Union. Actually, I had that backwards. American, British, France. Now, to this day, I still don't know why the Soviet Union had so much more than everybody else. But neither here nor there. The whole point here is that Berlin is in the middle of East Germany. And so we were trying to get supplies to our portion of Berlin. We would truck them in. The Soviets decided they needed to search everything. Americans not real happy with that, and they come up with what's called the Berlin Airlift, where they lifted materials by air into the city. And that goes on for a year or two. In April of 1949, Western nations began a collective security pact. This is going to be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. Under the NATO pact, 12 nations, U.S., Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, and Ireland, agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against all of them. 1949, those nations also agreed to the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, which is going to become West Germany. In response, the Soviet Union created the German Democratic Republic and the Warsaw Pact, which is equivalent to NATO for Eastern Europe. The continent is divided by East and West, with the East being cut off from the rest of the continent. And the line is about right here. I guess you take in East Germany, but there's basically a line of communism on the right, non-communism on the left. Churchill gives a famous Iron Curtain speech, which calls that an Iron Curtain. But it's not a physical actual. Now, why they ring the bell at 3 o'clock, I don't know, but they do. Anyway, mates tell the teachers to go home, so maybe I should do that. Nah, I'll finish first. All right, from the Marshall Plan, you can see first cargo of Caribbean sugar shipped under Marshall aid, so assistance. And this is the Berlin Airlift. So literally flying planes in to get people equipment and stuff. All right, the NSC 68. The U.S. entertained the possibility of international control of nuclear technology, but rejected it in order to maintain advantage over the Soviet Union. In September 1949, the Soviets detonated an atomic bomb. Truman then turned to the U.S. National Security Council, established by the National Security Act of 1947, for a strategic reassessment of U.S. security issues. In April 1950, the NSC delivered its report, known as NSC 68. The document marked a decisive turning point in the U.S. approach to the Cold War and encouraged the development of a hydrogen bomb, as well as increased taxes to pay for dramatic increases in defense. Many historians view the report as having militarized the American approach to the Cold War. So you can see we've got weapons, we're increasing our military, and we're really doing this in response to communism and the way Soviet Union is taking care of things. All right, so containment. So we're going to start in Asia here. The civil war in China, so the communist forces led by Mao Zedong challenged nationalist forces under Xing Zhaixi. I think that's right. Anyway, between 1945 and 1949, the U.S. gave Xing's army $2 billion in aid to save China. In 1949, the U.S. cut off aid and Mao was victorious. Mao formed alliances with the Soviet Union. Truman's State Department was blamed for losing China. So that's where China again becomes communist. All right. So at the end of the war, end of World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union jointly occupied Korea, divided at the 38th parallel. Soviets supported Kim Il-sung in North Korea. The U.S. backed Syngman Rhee in South Korea. The desire to reunify led to a northern military action with the Security Council's approval of a peacekeeping force. Truman ordered U.S. troops to Korea. War begins with a counterattack by the Chinese in response to General MacArthur sending troops across the 38th parallel. The dispute with MacArthur led to his dismissal. The war dragged on for 2 years. Defense spending grew enormously, and U.S. foreign policy had become more global and militarized at a huge expense. Let's see, as far as the Munich analogy, memory of Hitler's appeasement influenced U.S. policy in the 1950s. They feared that appeasing Stalin would lead to further war. Instead, the U.S. staunchly resisted Soviet influence in Germany, Greece, Korea, Iran, Guatemala, and Vietnam. All right. Let's see. 1948 election. So Truman had hoped for an expansion of the New Deal. The Democratic Party was in disarray in 1945. The left wing split off and formed the Progressive Party, nominating Henry A. Wallace. The Southern delegations bolted and called themselves Dixiecrats, protesting the party's civil rights platform and supporting segregation. The Republican Party, meanwhile, nominated the politically moderate Governor Thomas Dewey, Republican from New York. Truman won a surprise 49.6% of the vote to Dewey's 45.1%. All right, let's talk the fair deal. So in 1949, Truman proposes... Oh, I always find this picture amusing. They really thought that Dewey was going to win. And so even newspapers had pre-printed that Dewey had beat Truman. But it does not happen. It's very close, but it does not happen. All right. 1949, Truman proposes the fair deal. The National Health Insurance, aid for education, a housing program, expansion of Social Security, a higher minimum wage, and a new agricultural program. Congress and the public were reluctant to support an enlarged welfare state. Truman's proposal for national health insurance was denounced as socialized medicine by the American Medical Association and the insurance industry. In the end, the fair deal's only major achievement, other than improvements to Social Security and the minimum wage, was the National Housing Act of 1949, which built 810,000 low-income units. All right, loyalty security programs. So historians today know that there was significant penetration of the U.S. government by the Soviet Union during the 1930s. They believe most had stopped by 1947. Truman believed he had to protect his administration against charges of espionage. He issues Executive Order 9835, which created the Loyalty Security Program. It permitted officials to investigate employees of the federal government for subversion. The loose interpretation led to accusations. States began their own program and began to require loyalty oaths for employees. Labor unions were hit by charges of communists within their ranks, as were the NAACP and the National Urban League. The Red Scare spread from the federal government to the further reaches of American organizational, economic, and cultural life. Then we have HUAC and McCarthyism. So, this is always interesting. So the House Un-American Activities Committee is launched by Congressman Martin Dies of Texas and other conservatives in 1938. It helped spark the Red Scare by holding widely publicized hearings in 1947 on alleged communist infiltration in the movie industry. A group of writers and actors, dubbed the Hollywood 10, were jailed for refusing to testify about past associations. The accused were blacklisted. Soviet archives tell us today that the Communist Party in the U.S. was taking money and instruction from the Soviet Union. Let's see, McCarthyism. So Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Democrat from Wisconsin, marked both the apex and then the finale of the Red Scare in February of 1950. He claimed to have a list of known communists working in the State Department. He waged a smear campaign against those who were soft on communism. In early of 1954, McCarthy overreached by launching an investigation into subversive activities in the U.S. Army, with live hearings that were broadcast on TV. Public support for McCarthy's tactics plummeted, and the Senate voted to censure him for unbecoming conduct in December of 1954. So he accused people left and right. He said, I have these lists, I've got all these things, and people were afraid, and they were afraid that somebody was going to name them, whether they were communists or not, because being called a communist was just as bad as almost being one at that point in time. So this was crazy time period. But it all ends, and McCarthy just kind of falls off the face of the earth. Actually, he dies pretty soon after. All right, so politics of Cold War liberalism and our next president, Eisenhower. So he sets the tone for modern republicanism, an updated approach that aimed at moderating, not dismantling, the New Deal state. Under Eisenhower, Nikita Khrushchev, who's going to follow Stalin as the leader of the Soviet Union in 1956, so they changed places. I think Eisenhower comes in 1954. 52. So he becomes president in 53. So a few years later. So he does work with Stalin at some point. But Khrushchev calls for peaceful coexistence with the West and denounces Stalin's regime. But he crushed Hungarian independence movement. The Eisenhower administration's new look at defense policy increased production of the hydrogen bomb. Eisenhower was reluctant to criticize McCarthy or to speak out on civil rights. Oddly enough, he was kind of mild-mannered in comparison to the reason he wins is because of his war record. Democrats were strong in Congress but proved weak in presidential elections. Largely agreed with Republicans on pressures of the Cold War and the demands of a modern industrial economy. All right, so to Vietnam. So Eisenhower's more concerned about anti-communism than stability in foreign governments. The CIA was created in 1947. It utilized secret operations and coups to combat communism. In August of 1945, Vietnam declared independence from France. Did we ever talk about the result of the Korean War? Oh, basically they stayed at the 38th parallel. Sorry, it just remained north and south. Pretty much nothing changed. Vietnam's different. Eisenhower feared a French failure to restore control of the so-called domino theory, that communism spreading beyond Indochina. So basically one of the big reasons we went to help Vietnam is because of the domino theory. And basically the idea is that one country falls to communism and others will soon fall after. So the idea was that if Vietnam fell to communism, so would Cambodia and Laos. And you can see they border Vietnam. The U.S. rejected the Geneva Accords and used the CIA. Did I skip something? Oh, the result was the Geneva Accords, which partitioned Vietnam at the 17th parallel with reunification and elections to come in 1956. The U.S. rejected the Geneva Accords and used CIA to install a pro-U.S. government in South Vietnam. No Dinh Diem. Reunification did not occur. U.S. began sending Diem approximately $200 million a year in aid, plus military advisors. This is how it all starts. In the Middle East, Palestine populated by Arabs was believed to be the Jewish homeland. When British mandate in region ended, Zionists declared the State of Israel. The Arab League invaded, but Israel survived. Palestinians were forced out of region and into refugee camps. President Truman recognized Israel as a new nation and won support from American Jewish voters. Egyptian independence was declared in 1952. It was led by Nasser, who wanted to be neutral in the Cold War. Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. British, France, and Israel attacked Egypt and seized the canal. Eisenhower demanded that they pull out of the region. Nasser reclaimed the canal and used Soviet support to build the Aswan Dam on the Nile. In early 1957, concerned about Soviet influence in the Middle East, the president announced the Eisenhower Doctrine, which stated that American forces would assist in any nation in the Middle East that required aid against international communism. So we are becoming the saviors of the world. Vietnam, I'm quite confident we will talk more about as we travel through the Cold War, because Vietnam's not going to end until the 70s. So, all right, American global defense treaties in the Cold War era. So you can see NATO right here, signed in 1945 by the 10 countries we already talked about. You've got CETO, which is going to be the Southern Asian Treaty. This is going to be Australia, France, New Zealand, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, United Kingdom, and the United States. We're both part of both. ANZUS is going to be Australia, New Zealand. We signed in 1951. The Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, signed in 1951. South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty, 1953. The Central Treaty Organization, signed in 1959 and disbanded in 1979. Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, United Kingdom, United States. You can see we're just part of everything. And the Rio Treaty, Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. I guess we're not part of that. They didn't invite us to that party. But we're part of almost everything else. So, anyway. Alright. Containment in the post-colonial war. So the election of 1960 and the new frontier. So Kennedy defeated Nixon in the campaign after 4 nationally televised debates swayed voters to his usual attractive candidacy. He received 49.7% of the popular vote to Nixon's 49.5%. And it's quite possible if those debates were not televised, that Nixon would have likely won. He was Eisenhower's VP. People knew him. People liked him. It is quite possible he would have beat Kennedy out had it not been for his awkwardness on the TV. Kennedy. Kennedy. All right. So Kennedy follows through on a CIA-supported Eisenhower plan to lead an uprising against Castro in Cuba. And let's be clear about Cuba. Castro comes in the early 50s and overthrows the current dictator there. His name is Bautista. That's his last name. And that's when the problems with Cuba really start. If you recall, we gained them as a protectorate, basically. After the Spanish-American War, we helped them fight their independence from Spain. And basically, we kind of advised and whatnot. And Bautista was kind of like a United States puppet. And Castro, not a big fan of that. And he just kind of thought that the Cubans needed to take over for the Cubans. And that's what his whole thing was about. He takes over the country. And when he does that, there are numerous attempts by the United States government and the CIA to assassinate Castro. Clearly, none of them are successful since he only just recently died. So when Kennedy follows through on this plan that Eisenhower had to lead an uprising against Castro in Cuba, this is called the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, Cuba's Bay of Pigs, and it fails. And that's when they kind of realized what the United States is trying to do. So in June of 1961, Khrushchev, and this is going on at the same time. So April 1961 is the failure of the Bay of Pigs. June of 1961, Khrushchev is going to blockade West Berlin. Kennedy responded by dispatching 40,000 American troops to Western Europe. In August of 1961, the communist government of East Germany built a wall to stop Easterners from fleeing to West Berlin. And I will tell you, there is documented evidence that Kennedy makes the statement of, well, if they're trying to keep him in, why don't they build a wall? That is the gist of it. So Kennedy actually makes a suggestion. And it could have been something that was talked about before, quite likely. But it is something he suggests happen. So it happens during his presidency. So you've got all that going on, and you've got this bad blood between the United States and the Soviet Union. So when Castro takes over Cuba and doesn't really want to do what the United States wants to do, That's when we decide we are not going to have anything to do with Cuba. So Cuba needs to sell its sugar. So Cuba turns to the Soviet Union. And it gains their relationship with the Soviet Union. They're both communist countries. They both have dictators, essentially. And so they have an agreement. So fast forward to October of 1962. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis. So basically, the Soviet Union sends missiles over to Cuba. It sets these little missiles up. And these missiles happen to be aimed at the United States. It is not entirely sure if they would have actually shot these missiles off. But basically, we find out because we have secret missions that are still going on, trying to fly over Cuba and find out what's going on in Cuba. And so we find out about the missiles. Kennedy talks to Khrushchev and basically is like, what's with the missiles? And he says, yeah, so it goes on for like 12 days. Kennedy even makes an announcement to the American public. So there's missiles aimed at the United States from Cuba. It's all kinds of craziness. Essentially, the Cuban Missile Crisis does eventually end when the Soviets basically agree to take down the missiles in return for the United States never bothering Cuba again. So we have to stop all our secret missions. We have to stop trying to assassinate Castro. And that is the end of our relationship with Cuba as we know it. And so the regrowth of that has only happened within the last few years. So anyway, this is going to bring the U.S. closer to nuclear war with the Soviets than ever before. All right. On the plus side, Kennedy also launches a series of bold non-military initiatives. One was the Peace Corps, which embodied a call to public service and was intended to provide the Third World with an anti-communist alternative. Kennedy also championed space exploration, proposing to have a man on the moon within the decade. Persuaded Congress to increase funding for the government space agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, enabling the U.S. to pull ahead of the Soviet Union. Because in 1957, I think it is, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which starts the space race. All right, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you can see the missiles right there. This is the Berlin Wall being built, or when it first was built. All right, back to Vietnam. Kennedy tries to expand the role of the U.S. Special Forces, or the Green Berets, in Vietnam, where Diem's opponents had formed the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong. Diem's strategic Hamlet program alienated peasants by moving them into barbed wire compounds. Persecuted Buddhists staged dramatic demonstrations and committed self-immolations to protest Diem's regime. Received worldwide outrage. Chaos in South Vietnam. So in November 1963, Kennedy's administration becomes increasingly frustrated with Diem, but still supported his regime. Diem was overthrown by military generals and assassinated. The South fell into chaos with a series of coups and no clear leadership. Kennedy himself was assassinated 3 weeks later. We don't pull out of Vietnam until Nixon's presidency. And we have Johnson that comes after Kennedy. So I guess that's all we've got in this particular chapter. I do know we are talking more about the Cold War as we move forward. And next week I'm going to show you Duck and Cover. So I will talk to you or see you later. So I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening.